Valuation seminar series. My name is Nicoletta Battini, and I'm lead evaluator of the office. Today, the seminar is on a renewed commitment to sustainable development goals in a post-COVID world.
Maybe you can. We expect to hear what from you. What do you think we can collaborate together? What do you expect from us? And then
can we have people on mute, please? Hello, we can hear people chatting in the back.
Yeah, so maybe we can start.
Okay, so let's start with the ground rules. Ground rules, if you could put yourself on mute, especially the people that just joined, be careful when you join in to have your speaker on mute. If you need to ask a question, just put in the chat and we'll address those in sessions after the speakers have spoken. So the title of the seminar today is A Renewed Commitment, SDGs in a Post-COVID World. And we have two very distinguished guests. We're going to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who teaches at Columbia University and is director of its Center for Sustainable Development. He's one of the world leading experts on sustainable development and economic development more generally, and of course the fight against poverty. Professor Sachs has co-received the Blue Planet Prize in 2015, which is basically the Nobel Prize for environmental leadership, and he's been named by newspapers as the best, the most important, maybe the best known economist in the world. So we're very looking forward to hear his views about SDGs and his recent work. We also have, I'm very honored to have Mark Plant, who's co-director of Development Finance, Senior Policy Fellow and Chief Operating Officer of the Center for Global Development in Europe. He's based in London at the moment, and his appointment at the CGD follows a long career at the fund, where, among other things, last he was also Director of Human Resources. So we have, of course, some questions about, what he's going to talk in relation to resources for climate change analysis. Let's kick off with Mark, perhaps, if you don't mind. And let's see how it goes with Jeff. We might have a limited time allotment for us, so we might have to juggle around. But Mark, if you are fine to start, we would be very glad to hear you tell us what you think about your topic. Thank you.
Sure, it would be my pleasure, Nicoletta. Thank you for inviting me. Let me get my screen up, if this works. And just confirm that you're all seeing that.
On them by next Friday, which is the next.
I think I hear someone else. So again, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the IEO for having me. There's no doubt that COVID-19 has disrupted the path to the SDGs that was chartered in 2015. And I'm sure Jeff, when he speaks this afternoon, will go into that more. But I think the crisis has put into stark relief the vulnerability of the global economy and the need for concerted action. I read this week that the latest estimates on the melting of the polar ice caps indicate that we're on a worst case scenario trajectory in climate change. So the economic disruption that's been caused by COVID should make us all pause and think about what would happen if we reach a climate tipping point instead. In 2020, countries naturally turned inward to assist and protect their own citizens, with global and multilateral action taking a back seat for most governments. Nonetheless, the IFIs, and notably the IMF, rose to the occasion and drew on their resources to assist emerging markets and developing countries who had fewer tools in their crisis toolkits. The hope for 2021 is that multilateral cooperation will be renewed as we look to rebuild out of the COVID crisis. While all the SDGs were going to require cooperation, I think climate change presents the most immediate vulnerability and where the public goods motivation for collective action is strongest. And I believe there's a strong case for the IMF to play a central role in the global effort to confront climate change, both through global efforts to mitigate change as well as to deal with the economic impact of whatever change does come about. And today, in a few brief moments, I would like to share with you why I think that discussion of how the IMF might be involved. I think, let me see if I got this. I'm getting it approved. So I can go to the next slide. Hold on, I'm having a bit of trouble here. Pardon me, I'm not, there we go. There we go. I think the case for IMF involvement in climate is, as I said, evident. The economic issues are at the core of the problem. It's a choice problem. We have a choice to invest now in climate mitigation, to decrease the costs of climate change in the future, or we cannot invest now and bear those costs in the future. And it's a trade-off, like all economic decisions are. And so the fundamental problem is in many ways economic. And I think it's a global good, it's very much a global goods problem. Actions for climate change and mitigation are diffuse. It will require actions on the part of global policymakers at the national level, at the local level, at the individual level. But the results are going to be shared. The collective results of all our actions will affect the future of each and every person on the planet. So it's a natural public goods, global public goods issue that calls for global action and concerted global action in the multilateral system in particular. And I think the IMF has to be one of the players in the multilateral system, not the only one. And I think some of the issues that climate change and climate mitigation raise are directly relevant to the fund's core mandate. The climate change risks threaten global economic growth, they threaten global economic stability, and they threaten financial stability. The financial system will be either of critical help or a hindrance to the efforts to mitigate climate change. Whether we do something or not. If we don't do something, there will be substantial expenditure needed to protect peoples, to protect nations, to protect infrastructure. If we do something, we have to invest in new kinds of infrastructure, new kinds of productive capacity, and that will cost money. So you have growth, stability, you have financial systems implications, you have fiscal implications. Those all fall squarely within the fund's mandate. And it's at a global level, it's also at a national level. And so the idea that you move from national to global policies, again, is a negative for the IMF. I think there's some big issues on the horizon, again, that fall squarely within the IMF's mandate. I'm going to list some. I don't think I have the entire list, but it gives you some idea of the types of issues that we'll be confronting. I think already you see IMF teams confronting the costs of increased extreme weather events, particularly in island states, but weather events are expanding well beyond island states, into mainland states, into all sorts of geographies where agriculture is being disturbed, fisheries are being disturbed, people are moving. The extreme weather events are resulting in economic displacement of one kind or another that affects medium-term and long-term growth prospects as well as productivity. So it's an economic problem. You're going to have increased public infrastructure investment, either if you do climate mitigation, or if you defer action, don't do climate mitigation, wait for the effects of climate change to come. You will need different kinds of roads, different kinds of transport systems, different kinds of energy transmission systems, different kind of communications. All of this will depend on how much climate change there is. If you're spending public infrastructure, you have a fiscal problem that you have to confront, again, either now or in the future. There'll be a change in productive infrastructure. If we pursue a progressive climate mitigation strategy, we will have to change the carbon dependence of our economy, our dependence on petroleum products for energy generation. That is a basic change in the productive infrastructure of most countries in the world. It will change how we produce, what we produce, how fast we can do it. And again, this is fundamental to the economic structures, to the growth prospects, and to the prosperity of nations. There will be trade impacts. Nations will start producing different things. There will be impediments on how much can be traded, how it is traded. And so the trade impacts will have balance of payments impacts that will have knock-on financial sector impacts. So again, whether there's action or inaction, we will see trade impacts, and the fund will have to be involved in evaluating those. There's certainly to be migration impacts. Already we see migratory flows out of Africa into Europe, in part based on climate considerations. Those will only get worse if we do nothing to mitigate climate. Africa is slated to be one of the worst affected areas in the world by climate. People will not be able to survive. They'll move to Europe in much greater numbers than they are now. That has medium-term and long-term implications, economic implications, that are of central concern to the fund. And so I think in all, there's one more area, you'll see changes in asset valuation. If we move, again, to a non-carbon based energy production, countries with substantial petroleum product deposits will see the value of their assets change. This will change their wealth and their well-being, and will also change financial flows throughout the world, excuse me. Climate is going to play a critical role, both in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, and the fund will have to have a view on how these changes are taking place and what the impact is on the local and global economies. Some of these seem far out. Some of these seem a bit away. They may be 5, 10, 15 years away. And so there's a question as to why the fund should be involved at this point. Why now? I think there are issues on the policy agenda in the year ahead that the fund will have to weigh in on. There's certainly an important ongoing discussion about how the financing to help ensure the post-COVID recovery building can be made green. How can it support a sustainable future? There's discussions about how private financing can favor green energy generation, can favor decreased petroleum product generation. How is it that private investment should be channeled as we go through this rebuilding process? What's the regulatory role of central banks? What's the regulatory role of ministries of finance and other regulatory agencies at the global level and at the local level? And there's quite an interesting and prolonged discussion about the use of public money to spur private investment, so-called blended finance. If we're to do the types of investment that are needed to rebuild from COVID and to rebuild toward a sustainable future, these amounts of private flows will have to be large and will have substantial economic impacts in the months and years ahead. There's a long discussion about how public finance should be redirected to support a green rebuilding. Public finance, again, is square in the fund's wheelhouse, and the fiscal problems that are confronted are going to be discussed really in the next year. Development assistance, we had a recent conference of development leaders, and they expect their spending on climate to increase by about 50% over the next. Where does this money go to developing countries? Is it additional to what's being spent already for development, or is it substitutional? And what are the conditions attached to this development assistance? How can must we ensure that development assistance only supports green projects? Again, for those people who work on developing countries, you're used to this type of argument about conditionality and additionality. And I think there are many people who are looking to the fund to drive much of this discussion. Like it or not, the fund was seen as very successful in 2020 in responding to the COVID crisis. People look to the fund as an intellectual leader. They're looking to the fund to lead at least the financial rebuilding post-COVID, and they want the fund to take a stance on how that financial rebuilding should be structured to help a sustainable recovery. So the fund is going to be involved in these discussions, whether it wants to or not. There's a very active discussion about how the debt relief that will be given ultimately to some middle-income countries and some developing countries, how that debt relief should be used to promote a green recovery in two aspects. When you do your debt sustainability analysis, your DSA, how do climate risk and investment need figure into that DSA as you look to the future? But also people are positing that debt relief should be conditioned on countries having sound, sustainable recovery plans. Is that a good idea or a bad idea? The fund's going to be driving the debt relief discussion. It will be involved in this discussion of whether debt relief should be green or not. As countries emerge from the COVID crisis, they're going to start increasing taxes again. There are many countries who are considering that this is a moment to increase carbon taxes. Carbon pricing is a live issue, much thanks to FAD, who's put it on the radar. And I think in the next year, you'll see lots of countries discuss whether to do it and grappling with the political consequences of doing it. Here in Europe, the EU is actively considering pricing carbon at the border. That is putting a tariff on carbon-intensive goods as they come into the EU. That's something of global consequence, a global economic consequence, that again, the fund, I think, will be drawn in to that discussion. My view is that the tools exist at the fund to look at all these issues. The surveillance publications, the IEO, the GFSR, the Fiscal Monitor have already had chapters on climate, the potential impact of climate, the macro relevance of climate. The fund recognizes the macro relevance of climate. Some Article 4 consultations have looked at climate issues in their individual country assessments. There are these climate change policy assessments, 6 or 8 of which were done a few years ago. I know the fund is looking to revive those. The financial sector stability assessments are beginning to look at the issues of asset valuation and the vulnerability of financial systems to climate change and to the greening of the financial systems. The public investment management tool, PIMA, can help countries decide how they structure their investments effectively. As I mentioned before, the DSA is going to be drawn into the climate debate. And I think there will be a long debate about whether fund facilities, whether in the GRA or in the PRGT, should be used to encourage green growth and green recovery. I think the fund has a bunch of decisions to make going forward. The climate is a huge area. I think, just as I've spoken here, I've raised things that touch on every department of the fund. The question is, what areas does the fund want to get into and how fast do they want to do it? There's some climate would like to see a climate assessment, a macro climate assessment for all 190 member countries tomorrow. That's not going to be possible. So the fund needs to have a strategy about what issues it takes, at what pace, and at what level, global or national. I think the fund needs to, in doing that, the fund needs to look at where the impact points are. What are the global policies and what are the countries where the fund can have an important impact on the climate change discussion? Not just climate change per se, but the climate change discussion globally. And again, that's a strategic discussion that has to be had within the institution. There's a question as to how to structure the work within the IMF. I know many countries are ramping up their climate work with small groups of climate inclined economists, if you will, climate experts that they're developing with some coordination from SPR. Is that the right structure or not? Should it be a broader structure? I'm not a great believer in restructuring a whole institution over an issue, but the question is, how do you make these teams work together across the institution well? And I think the board has to play an important role in this. Already the board has given its encouragement to management and staff to pursue these climate issues, but as management and staff develop a more targeted strategy, the board will have to bless that strategy and ensure that adequate staffing is needed. And my sense is that this is a complicated enough area that current staffing will not be adequate. You're going to have to add on. To say do more with less isn't an answer that's going to be adequate for climate. I think it's going to also be important that the fund partner with others. There is public pressure that's building on the fund and will continue to build for, as I said, the fund to be a leader in this area. The fund will have to respond to that pressure, whether it likes to or not. The fund is already, the leadership of the fund has already put the fund, if you will, in the center of the discussion. I think what's critical is that the fund begin to make itself understood as to what it's going to do in the climate area, what it can and can't do. My view is, my perception is that the fund is not well understood by climate advocates and experts. Many climate advocates think the fund can do everything. Many advocates think the fund is impotent. It reminds me of the debates we had at the time of poverty, when we were looking at doing poverty around the turn of the century, around 2000. We had to integrate other communities into our thought processes. We didn't know how to do that very well in 2000. We know how to do that well. We've been doing it for the last 20 years or so. But I think there needs to be a process of integrating the fund into the climate community and vice versa. And I think there's considerable informed expertise beyond the World Bank. There's always a temptation in the fund to say microeconomic issues, that's the World Bank. We'll take the macro and it will split evenly. I think there are a lot of people outside the World Bank who will be able and willing to interact with the fund in a fruitful way, who can give you the tools that you might need to do the analyses that will integrate into all the normal fund tools that you use to do economic analysis. This will all take a concerted effort. It will take a strategic effort, but I think you have willing partners out there in the world to work with you. Let me stop there and open it for discussion. Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much for this very well-focused and enlightening presentation. I want to go straight to Professor Sachs, who is going to talk us about the likely
That is something that we'll work with.
Pandemic. I
Thank you.
hear some.
So I think
Oops.
that will be very helpful.
I keep shutting down one person in particular, and I email them as well. So Professor Sachs should talk about the impact of the pandemic on attaining the Sustainable Development Goals, drawing on his June 2020 Sustainable Development Report and his subsequent work. And interesting also for the fund, in addition to this, he will also discuss the role that the fund can play in helping to put the achievement of the SDGs back on track. Professor Sachs?
Great, Nicoletta. Thank you very much, and good to be with everybody. And Mark, thank you for an excellent presentation. I think there are and that we ought to keep clear. One is the emergency of COVID-19. The second is the SDG financing, which is an agenda approximately to 2030, in which there were already very serious unmet financial needs. It's the on climate, biodiversity, a more fundamental transformation. All of these have a strong development and a strong multilateral dimension to them. When it I think that there are two aspects where the fund can play a very important role in the COVID-19. One is the and last year's 100 billion roughly of emergency finance was very, very important, and we need more of that in 2021, absolutely, without question. So making sure that the fund has the board mandate and the firepower and the technical means to move forward and not any labored DSA benchmarks, but rather free lending into an emergency is vital. We know that the rich countries are doing that basically with abandon. The United States had a $2.1 trillion package in March, a $900 billion package in December. President Biden's just put a $1.9 trillion package on the table, and there's more to come. So we're talking about 10 to 20% of GDP deficit financing, and the poor countries can't do that. So the poor countries need the fund because the poor countries can't do market or monetary financing at anything like the scale of the crisis that they face, and that means the fund. That should not be a surprise. That's the reason why the fund was created. So this is a core. It's not ancillary. It's not inventing a new purpose. It is circumstances like the one that we're in right now. There will be cleanup down the road. This is not the time for cleanup. This is the time for making sure people eat, making sure that vital services are maintained, making sure that there are test kits, PPE, community health workers, everything that is needed. And as many fine reports have emphasized in recent weeks, this is not a gift, this is not charity, this is the most basic sanity of an internationally transmissible virus. For God's sake, don't think that you're sitting alone. Today, we have the first reports of the South African variant showing up in South Carolina. Well, of course. So we're in a global pandemic, and a global pandemic has to be fought everywhere, including the places that don't have the financial firepower to fight it. In that context, there's a second dimension of emergency support that's needed, and that's for global public goods. We need COVAX fully funded, to put it basically. So COVAX is the commitment to get immunization coverage to developing countries. But there are a couple of problems. One is that COVAX goes around begging, whereas rich countries just buy. And so COVAX has promises of 2 billion doses, but it doesn't have them in delivery. And there's a long wait ahead. And the United States, Europe, Israel, others just step in front and buy up the doses. And that's what's happened so far. But there's another point that makes this more than an equity question. By committing to production, we can increase significantly the plant capacity for many of the vaccines, not for all of them, maybe not for the mRNA scaling, but for many of the other vaccines, which are much more standard production. There are ways to requisition more productive capacity. That's COVAX's role. And this needs block financing. So I believe that the SDR allocation that is on its way should be designated in part, it may be $650 billion or something like that. Put 30 or 40 or 50 billion of that into a COVAX managed fund for group procurement on behalf of IMF member countries. Because we need to move. And the fund is the place to move. The bank has, promised 12 billion, but they can't move vaccines this way. This is why we have COVAX, why we have the logistical operations created. They actually exist, but they're not funded. And you can't go one by one for development aid. You can't go begging to governments because that's parliamentary processes. So that's why we have the IMF. Use it. Wonderful institution. Extremely important. If it didn't exist, we'd be inventing it. But fortunately, it was invented 76 years ago. So this is the time to use it. Put the SDRs, just a fraction of them, put 30 or 40 billion dollars into vaccine coverage and perhaps other ACT accelerator areas, PPE, tests, and so forth. This is the last place we should be scrimping on right now when we're trying to get a $100 trillion economy on its feet and stop people from dying in mass numbers. Okay, that's COVAX, and that's COVID-19. Move on the financing this year. And fortunately, we have an administration that is not insane like we used to have. So we can actually do some sensible things. I mean, not just not insane, actually very multilateral and very well directed. Second point, the SDGs need financing. And I worked with the Fiscal Affairs Department, with Vitor Gaspar and his team on their excellent work looking at financing gaps for the SDGs. The 57 LIDCs, low-income developing country category of the IMF, has maybe a minimum $300 billion a year perhaps up to $500 billion a year financing gap for SDG fulfillment, for electrification, for renewable energy, for basic infrastructure, for getting kids in school, for universal health coverage, and so forth. This is not a lot of money in macro terms, obviously. This is a 0.5% of world output, even less perhaps. Part of it should be domestic resource mobilization over the coming years. That depends heavily on global tax reform being successful, because right now countries aren't able to get their hands on digital or on royalties or on corporate income that they should. So that's a matter of global tax reform. But it's also a matter of debt financing, taking into account the low interest rate environment that we have. This is the time for investment. And developing countries should be borrowing to the hilt in order to finance the SDGs. But the counterpart of that borrowing should be the multilateral development banks. And so one practical thing that we should be doing is tremendously increasing the firepower of the MDBs. And the beauty of it is that every dollar of paid-in capital is multiplied basically 6 times for callable capital, which is multiplied 5 times by leverage of the MDBs, which can be multiplied perhaps another 2 times by co-financing projects with the private sector. In other words, each dollar of appropriation from the US Congress can arguably produce $50 or $60 of financing. And we need that. I think if our countries shifted from bilateral aid to multilateral aid, by recapping and upcapping the MDBs, we would get 30 times multiple of development finance of what we have right now. And it doesn't have to be zero. It doesn't have to be grants. The interest rates are so low that if we tap into 40 years at 2% interest, and it's even less than that in Germany and elsewhere, developing countries can borrow very, very heavily at guaranteed low interest, long maturities for financing fiber, water, sanitation, renewables, all the things that are necessary for achieving the sustainable development goals. So I think if we think about the financial architecture, we don't have to create agony in the Congress or in the other donor countries. We just have to get already even for reprogramming it, just reprogram a significant amount of the bilateral aid into multilateral, multiply it, make that the paid-in capital for a massive capital increase, multiply it by market financing by these institutions, multiply it by designing projects for co-financing. We could expand by hundreds of billions of dollars the total amount of financing to face the kinds of issues that Mark was just talking about on climate finance. So I think we just need some creative accounting right now, not to hide realities, but basically to take into account the very low interest rate environment and to use that to coordinate on the globally agreed goals. And that's the third category. Mark talked mainly about that, the climate agenda. We ought to arrive in Glasgow with a universal commitment to full decarbonization by mid-century by everybody. That's what we need. It may be a little late to stay at 1.5 degrees C. We may have a bit of overshooting on that, but even so, we need to decarbonize globally by 2050. We know what that means technologically. It's actually quite straightforward, and that is no new coal, gas, or oil-fired power generation. It means no new internal combustion engine light-duty vehicles sold after 2030 or 2035. And you probably saw today's announcement by GM that it will not sell ICE automobiles after 2035. We're going to have the whole worldwide industry agreeing we're getting out of the internal combustion engine business. That's quite fundamental. And we are going to need a lot of installation of renewable energy, especially in the developing world where energy supply is so disastrously limited right now, but the potential for solar and hydro and other renewables is so large. And this all requires long-term project finance. But again, in a low interest rate environment, this is exactly what we ought to be basing the recovery on. The interest rates won't remain so low as we do this, by the way. I think one thing we should take into account is that real interest rates will start to rise again. That's okay. They won't go to horrific levels unless we really screw up macroeconomically. But if they are right now near zero, they may rise to 2% real or 3% real as we mobilize large-scale, long-term global financing for green infrastructure. But that's the name of the game. And it's the name of the game in every major economy. It will be Biden's recovery plan. It will be China's 14th five-year plan starting this year. It's the European Green Deal. It's the Korean Green Deal. It is the way forward. But we need that very significant scaled financing for developing countries if we're going to have anything like what we have promised ourselves as a decent, peaceful, and inclusive world. Let me end there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jeff. This was illuminating. Part on COVAX, I think it's, we wish we had more time to discuss, the implications of that. Of course, it's a really big issue. We have several questions in the chat, and I would like to start with one, since the topic here was, and relatedly, specifically the SDGs. One question to you, and then we'll have one for Mark, is the 2030 still a credible deadline for SDGs? Some, policymakers started to think maybe it's no longer a policy priority given COVID and climate change, and should we despair, or what's the likelihood? Thank you.
I think the key is that the digital world could enable a phenomenal acceleration and leapfrogging in critical areas. If we had universal digital coverage and the electrification behind it and the scale up of renewables, you could have every child in school, which is SDG 4. We could have universal health coverage with a very significant and meaningful dose of telemedicine as part of that, which is SDG 3. We could have a big shift towards environmental management because we'd have on-the-ground monitoring systems and digital control, which would make a very big difference. We could definitely achieve SDG 7, which is universal access to energy, because we really could scale up microgrids and off-grid solutions for what's largely an Africa problem now, not only, but largely an Africa problem of lack of access. India has essentially solved the electrification problem, not as reliably and as at scale, but basically has done that. But Africa is where the big challenge is, and we could still meet that goal. So I think that there's every reason to accelerate. I think we would lose on many fronts, both mood, consensus, drive, urgency, to start engaging in navel gazing of should we change to 2033, 2035. That would be a horrible discussion without any merit, in my view, in terms of getting practical results on the ground. We have to understand the SDGs is not a report card per se. So we're not punishing countries by keeping the SDGs intact, even if they're harder to achieve, which is how they're sometimes treated. This is unfair to developing countries. That is ridiculous. The SDGs are a message to us in the rich world. Get your goddamn act together to help the rest of the world. So by doing anything to undermine the SDGs, we do nothing for developing countries. But some people treat it, oh, you're grading too hard. This isn't for grading. This is to get kids in school. This is to get people with healthcare. This is to get electricity. This is to get clean air. It's not a matter of grading. If there's any grading, it's on us in the United States. We just lived through a criminal regime. So the grading is on us. And we shouldn't change, therefore, what was a hard global construction. We should accelerate. But actually, the practical point I'm making is that the tools are so good that, and if there were money there, obviously, you know how fast there could be universal connectivity? It would take about 2 years to achieve. The problem is poor households don't have the money at the other end. And so we need financing for this. But I'm in favor of borrowing the 200 billion that Africa might need for the fiber and the connections. Put it in debt. Put it in debt at 2%. 40 years repayment. It will pay for itself many times over. So I wouldn't even agonize over that piece of it. And I used to spend half my life begging for grants. I'm giving up on that too, because it's, anyway, that's where half my professional life went, was begging for grants. But since we can multiply money at very low interest and at long term, I think it's the more propitious thing to do right now.
Thank you. Now, we know you have a hard stop, so let me know in case, just let me know if you do. But here's another question for you, and then we go to Mark. So for one question to him at least. And the Asian economies, in your analysis, fared well according to what you find on SDG progress since 2015 when they were established. And their health response too to COVID-19 seems to have fared well. But of course, the mind goes to Asia when we think about COVID. I mean, that's where it comes from. That's where we think it comes from. And so one reason why they might have responded well is that they continue to have these zoonoses from, this agriculture and factory farming, and to some extent, the, this wildlife disturbance. So what can we do to stop pandemics from Asia and elsewhere? I mean, you do talk a lot about biodiversity, illegal trade, other things that can be done. It's a super important, and again, a fraction of expenditure there may fix, a much larger multiplied damage to the global economy.
Yeah. So I think a first point, very important, is the Asia Pacific region, or what's called the Western Pacific region for WHO parlance, has done extremely well in this pandemic. China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Cambodia, Lao PDR, Thailand have all kept cases per million at something like a 50th or 100th of what the US and Europe experienced. It's really telling. And it was already a divide as of March. I've been writing about this almost every 2 weeks since end of March, that there's a gap between the Asia Pacific and Europe and the US, and that we ought to learn from what the Asia Pacific is doing. First rule about the United States: it's nearly impossible to learn from any other country. It is just a brain lesion in the American brain, incapacity to learn from elsewhere. So interesting trying, but it's a kind of mental distortion which we can't get over. And if you say Asia Pacific, they say Communist Party of China. And by the way, you say, but you know, in any event, not only did China do a very good job, but it's not just China. It's Korea, it's Taiwan, it's Australia, it's New Zealand. How much more can they look like us, quote unquote? But we could not get that basic learning. Now, what did they do? It's just worth mentioning they did public health together with other things. They did mass testing and what's called active surveillance, which is you look at the connections of cases, and they did quarantine with a lot of public facilities. And they used information technology quite well, of course, especially China and Korea in that regard. And we spent a lot of time debating privacy and ended up with 450,000 deaths and so on. Not just that, because it wasn't just the debate about privacy, it was having a psychopath as president. But the truth is we did not do public health in this country till today, by the way. We don't have proper contact tracing, testing, isolation, which is the ABCs of public health. So I mention all of that because we have a lot to learn from the Asia Pacific, but they're good in many, many ways, not just this. They've been good for 30 years of development. Why? Because they understand that the essence of development is investment, not markets, it's investment. If you want development, you invest. And they understand that investment is in human beings first. So you get schools that work and you educate children so they can read, write, have scientific literacy, technical knowledge. All of the Asia Pacific, I mean, especially the Confucian Asian Pacific, is at the top of the list of performance. They understand that investment is about technological transformation. So they're all IT committed and so on. Now we have to make sure that they're green in addition, because a lot of this investment has been a dirty investment and it needs to be clean investment. But it's so impressive what Asia has done. And of course, this goes back to Japan's development model, Korea's development model, the Asian Tigers model, China's development model. And this is the model we need for Africa and for Latin America as well. And it's much less than we think it is about ease of doing business and much more about getting investments to where they are needed at scale. And that's about financing. And that's why I emphasized using the low interest rate environment for mass investments. And it means probably lots and lots of debt in practice, but at 2% interest 40 years. And if in 40 years from now it all proved bad, then somebody's going to write a dissertation about debt relief, as I did 40 years ago. And we will be back to a different problem. But for the moment, I would emphasize the investment profile. You asked me about the zoonotic diseases. They come from everywhere, by the way. Southeast Asia has produced a lot of zoonotic emergences, we think, like Zika, which eventually then showed up in Latin America. H1N1, we think, originated most likely in Mexico, in the U.S.-Mexican livestock industry. The corona bat viruses are probably Yunnan originated in southwest China. These zoonotic diseases are wherever there's an interface of humans and animal reservoirs. Ebola is in African origin, HIV almost surely was West African forest region with simian immunodeficiency virus. These zoonoses are going to come everywhere. So we need global surveillance. Of course, the first thing that idiot former president of the United States did was remove the surveillance teams from China so that we were completely blind to what was going on, because that's what cost cutting is. He stomped on the budget of CDC. And so he left the United States completely blind. There are other precautions to take, many other precautions about wet markets, trade in live animals, and so on. But clearly, we need surveillance first and foremost. I have a lot of colleagues who were predicting coronavirus epidemics. Of course, SARS had been a big hint. No one knew that what would emerge was something that was so unbelievably transmissible at a low symptomatic or asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic level, unlike SARS, which came only after a couple of weeks of the symptoms. So that's why SARS-CoV-2 proved to be so devastating. But we can be absolutely sure there will be more zoonoses on the way. And that's why we need WHO, global surveillance, trust among countries, cooperation, collaboration on this issue. And the returns, obviously, for the few $billion for a surveillance system, we would be saving trillions and trillions of dollars and millions of lives.
Thank you so much. Let me ask a question to Mark. There's a couple questions in the chat. One is by Hector Torres. I read it out. I agree that climate change is having already macro-critical consequences, and that the IMF should play an important role in helping countries deal with these consequences. But could the IMF go beyond giving policy advice? Could the IMF use bilateral conditionality to protect a global common? And how do you ensure even-handedness in the financial efforts that the fund may require from governments? Mark, do you have a reaction to this question?
I mean, that's a hard question. I think if the fund really buys in deeply to the climate mitigation strategies of the globe, it could use its conditionality in certain countries to encourage countries to follow those policies. It would require quite a bit of cooperation by the fund with people who understand the nuts and bolts of climate strategies. I don't think the fund is ever going to be the one that is helping countries concoct climate strategies. As I said earlier, I view the fund as the counselor, if you will, to the Minister of Finance and to the central governor. And in any country that's pursuing a climate strategy, there are financial implications, there are fiscal implications. And I think that's where the fund's role should be, in helping the country confront those financial and fiscal obligations or problems and obligations. If that is part and parcel, if some of those financial stresses result from the country's efforts to pursue climate mitigation, then the fund should try to assist them. There, you can make an argument there is a balance of payments, a long-term balance of payments problem that can arise from an aggressive strategy to pursue mitigation against climate change. The fund could assist on that. There's a certain analogy to the effort made, to the change, if you will, that the fund made around the year 2000 when it began to get into the poverty game. Right, in some sense, the fund realized that in order to there was more to fighting poverty than just macroeconomic stability. It had to get into the sustained growth business, and it tried to do that with the PRGF and the PRSP. You can make an analogy to climate. I hope we learn some of the lessons out of the PRSP, PRGT phase, if you will, of the fund's transformation, but it can be done.
I have a question. Maybe it can go to both, but I'll give it to Mark, and then we read one from here for Jeff. So can we tackle climate change using the same economic models and goals? This debate is resurfacing. Could it be that the fund needs not just to raise the volume on climate, but actually change the tone altogether, aiming for sustainable prosperity? So you still have growth, I guess, in parts of the world, but you don't need to continue to push for growth in countries that are fully grown, where you might want to go for not stagnation, but reasonably lower levels of aimed at growth, because you now have a transition from a certain type of lifestyle notionally to another one, which is more service oriented. I do maybe my nails or listen to a concert more than, I buy more stuff for my house that is exploding. I guess you can both take this. Let's start with Mark, and maybe Jeff is nodding, so maybe.
Look, I think the fund has done this before. The fund has recognized quite clearly that equity is an important part of growth. We think back to the time when the fund gave, in some sense, a blessing to the government of Tunisia for its good macroeconomic policies, and the country blew up several months later with the Arab Spring. There was clearly a problem with equity that was corrosive to the basic economic fiber of the country. Again, there's a similar analogy to sustainable growth in a climate sense or in many other, in the global senses of the SDGs. I think the world has recognized that there is a different type of economic arrangement that we're moving to. You don't measure purely by GDP growth. And others have put forward, I think, the correct argument that if you pursue the current path, you will ultimately run aground GDP growth. The climate change will catch up to you, and you'll ruin long-term growth processes. So it's a matter of transition, and it's a matter of expanding, if you will, the view of how you move from here to there. The fund was also very successful in helping the countries of the former Soviet Union transition. It's a similar kind of problem. And so I think that type of transition is what the fund has to have in mind. It has to keep in mind its métier of helping economies move forward. The question is how you measure that movement forward.
Thanks. And Jeff, do you have a reaction to that point about the growth model? I can't hear you.
There we go. I would say three things are important to keep in mind in that fascinating question. First, whatever economies do, they should be operating within the constraints of sustainable development, within the planetary boundaries, as it were. So that's why, no matter growth or no growth, we need to decarbonize the planet by mid-century, because the 1.5 degrees C is a limit for a very deep reason, actually many deep reasons. I won't belabor the point except to say that there are several critical ecological constraints that are right now at a paramount level, climate change being one, several pollutants being a second, and biodiversity conservation being a third. So we have profound challenges on land use and energy systems and materials, production and cycling and use that we need to get around. And that's going to be a binding constraint on all countries. And we're groping so slowly towards this, but we're getting there. The idea of universal decarbonization by mid-century is probably the clearest of these, but we're going to need similar boundary conditions in other areas as well. And I think we're on our way to that. Second point is again, a substantive point in the question you asked. It used to be presumed, and it was the shorthand of Adam Smith, that wealth was an adequate metric of well-being. And for the last 40 years, really starting with Richard Easterlin's powerful work, but mostly reality, we understand that when you reach a certain amount of wealth, the link of wealth and well-being is just not only not strong, and with the dramatic diminishing returns, but can be highly perverse if you continue on the wealth accumulation path as your goal for well-being. Smith was not wrong, I think, in 1776 to presume that wealth was an adequate metric of well-being. Of course, he didn't have GDP accounts at the time, but the idea that more of material goods per capita would be conducive to real improvement of life is true up to a point. It is not true after that point. And in the United States, we've had more than a tripling of per capita income since 1960, and absolutely not a smidgen of evidence of improved well-being in the subjective well-being sense. And in fact, since 2000, a pretty significant decline of well-being, and of course, the rising evidence of deaths of despair and suicide rates and so forth, and that's all pre-COVID. So we know that we can no longer, in a world of material plenty, make the shortcut that more is better. We need more quality of life. Then comes the third question of what does that imply for metrics and policy design? And there's a lot of work, of course, underway of using direct metrics of well-being, either objective metrics like the OECD has been championing, or subjective well-being metrics, as the psychologists, Kahneman and Diener and my colleagues Richard Layard and John Helliwell and others in economics have been propounding. We are moving in that direction, and we should move much more decisively in that direction to query, what are we after? And the lazy answer is, well, we're after another 0.5% of growth per year, is increasingly absurd. But it is our fallback right now still in the United States. We are one of the most absurd places on the planet, and we are hardest to change. And it was Puritans that invented this way of thinking back with John Locke and others, and it's going to be Puritans, the Protestants, that are going to be the last to come around, I'm afraid. So we actually have a philosophical issue here, but we have a practical metrics issue here, and we've got to get off the GDP as our goal and into quality of life and sustainable development. For poor people, it may not be so much different, but for rich people, it could be vastly different, those two different perspectives. And so this is why the orientation has to change. And I think I would emphasize the Sustainable Development Goals as a piece of that. I would emphasize the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity as a piece of that. And I would especially emphasize the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights as a fundamental part of that, because that one is based on human dignity for all. And that leads to a different set of economic assumptions if you follow the logic through, especially in rich countries. The United States ought to have been able to figure out by now that everybody should get health care in a GDP of $60,000 plus per capita. So I think your question is very pertinent, and more this change will come about because ultimately we're after well-being.
I offer sincere apologies on behalf of.
Ultimately, we're after well-being, and we were using wealth as a shorthand, and we don't need to use that shorthand anymore. It doesn't make sense for the rich part of the world, for sure.
Thank you. We have Rushir Agarwal who has a question. Rushir, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, the question about human nature again for Mark and Jeff. The focus of IFIs is often on multilateral cooperation, but are we really evolved enough as humans to rise above local politics, short-termism, our inner chimpanzee, to actually cooperate and tackle the global threat of climate change, of expanding manufacturing capacity? And if not, what can we do to align the social benefits of the climate change agenda, the pandemic fighting agenda, with the private benefits of individual actors?
Mark, you want to take that?
I was going to give it to you, Jeff, but it's a complicated question. I think we are capable of rising above it. I think you've seen numerous ways in which the international community has acted together, even within this crisis. I think the success of putting together vaccines in such a short order has been a way that countries have, in fact, worked together. It's hidden behind right now a great deal of conflict, but I don't think that could have come about a while ago. I think you saw countries band together in some respects through the great financial crisis, and we'll see how they do through this crisis. My sense is naturally people turned inside to protect their people, but as I said at the outset, I think they will turn outside. These are problems that can't be solved individually, that are going to be forced to be solved collectively. And maybe I'm just an optimist that will come about.
I would add to that I think it is your point, your question is exactly right, that we're hardwired to be in angst about this issue, because we're definitely hardwired for parochialism as well as for cooperation. And we really need to use our rational part of our makeup to overcome what are pretty hardwired instinctive reactions that are easily played. Trump isn't the first to play on fear and division and hate, and you make a pretty good political career till you burn down your country or destroy the world. And that's what these demagogues like Trump do for a living. And they get large followings that follow them. So it's a difficult question. But I think a few points. One is we have it within us to combat, but it really needs combating. And it's interesting that recently, our greatest moral leaders like Pope Francis or Patriarch Bartholomew have been issuing encyclicals about how to reach the whole world. The Pope's latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, is precisely about inter-regional, inter-religious cooperation. And I've never seen an encyclical like this. I don't know if it's unique, but he starts by thanking the Grand Imam of Al-Aqsa in the opening page of the encyclical as the inspiration for it, which I don't know if any Pope has done before, but I really liked it. This was about global reach. But the second point, I think, is global institutions. So one part is to train our minds properly, our cognition, our understanding about what global public goods are, to tap into our emotional and cultural responses in the right way. But the second is global institutions. And it does seem to me that we have, because of the disaster of World War II, we actually have functioning multilateral institutions for the first time in human history. It's amazing to my mind. And when I look at the performance of the IMF or the performance of the UN agencies in this crisis, I think it's exemplary, by the way. I think the quality of governance of the multilateral institutions is very, very high. And that is really something amazing because this system does not have the political support it needs. One thing I would like to come out of this is a greatly strengthened multilateralism. That's why I'd like the IMF to do a lot more right now. I'd like us to conceive of development finance as mainly through the multilateral development banks, because I think that they should play that galvanizing role. And one of the things, a pet project of mine, which I hope I could attract some co-workers on, is to substantially increase the UN's core budget. because we're in an absurdity right now that the core budget of the UN system is $3 billion a year. That's such rounding error. It's not even, recognized in a US budget item anymore. But we spend in the US 500 million for UN services. Come on, it's incredible how we're underspending on multilateralism. So I hope that we come out of this crisis with a very logical, rational commitment to the multilateral institutions as a fundamental lesson of all of this, and get the budgets that they need in line with that.
We have one very last question and we close because we are really hitting the wall. William, you had a question. Please go ahead.
This is a question for Professor Sachs. So building on your fascinating remarks on the relationship between economic growth and wealth, in particular in developed countries, advanced economies. So if we take that at face value, isn't there a fundamental contradiction between SDG 8 on economic growth and SDG 13 on climate action if we take it seriously the risk that we won't be able to achieve decarbonization fast enough, then more growth, especially in the large emitters, means more emissions and more climate change. So isn't there a fundamental contradiction between goal 8 and goal 13?
Yeah, thanks, William. I think fundamentally, we need more energy, primary energy use. You could call that growth of energy inputs, and it all needs to be clean. So we need a deep technological transformation, but I'm pretty sure that at the global scale, we need more terawatt hours per year by a very substantial margin. So one would call that growth. We don't necessarily need that exactly the same way in the United States, but in Africa, where there's very little electrification, we certainly need a massive increase of energy inputs, but it better be from zero carbon sources. Fortunately, the Sahel easily could provide all of the power needs of the whole world if we had the distribution systems with the wonderful sunshine in that region. So I think the main point is to be smart in what we're doing. I find the term growth at this point so problematic. If it just means GDP is conventionally measured, it's terrible on so many accounts. It just doesn't tell us very much about what's needed. And one of my teachers when I was young, and he was old and wonderful, was Simon Kuznets. And he was in retirement. I was a kid. And he took me under the arm and he said to me, how many times GDP is not a measure of well-being. It's a measure of market resources. It's a measure of transactions. It might be useful for Keynesian planning. It may be useful for wartime planning, which was the original idea of national accounting, how to pay for the war and so forth. But it was never meant to be a measure of well-being. And therefore, growth in that measure must not be our standard. Growth as an idea of progress, I like, because we can do better with so many things. And material increase in certain areas is inevitable because we still have billions of people who are bereft of the most basic access to safe water, sanitation, energy services, transport services, schools, clinics, hospitals, and so on. That will show up, much of that, in conventional GDP growth. In the United States, every time we measure how we're doing by what the GDP change is, I cringe, because it's obviously an absurdity for the United States to be chasing that number. it could be that if we did everything right, that measure sometimes would grow, sometimes wouldn't grow, but it must not be our target anymore. That's for sure. And I haven't read SDG 8, maybe carefully enough, but I've not read it as a mandate to the United States to focus narrowly on GDP growth. But I do like the focus on quality of jobs, for instance. I just think in the US that means more leisure time, among other things, not even more work time. So the point you raise is important. The answer that I would give is that we will need more material things in certain areas, almost surely in terawatt hours, especially as we electrify transport. But we will need less of other things, for instance, hydrocarbon production and mining, and how that shakes out in the GDP accounts can go either way because of how bad those accounts are at measuring what we really need.
I would like to thank both Mark and Jeff for their generosity with their time. I learned a lot. I stay here all day, but I know you guys got to go. I want to keep the dialogue open. Hopefully we can re-engage with you at a later time. I thank all the participants. And, this is an open agenda. The next 10 years have to be written. We need your guidance. So please don't abandon us. Let's keep talking. Thank you to everybody and see you soon.
Thank you, Nicoletta.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you today.
Thank you.